And we are back, episode number 29 of the Daru Strong Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Daru. Today we have our guest, Dr. Eric Helms. He came on the podcast, talked a lot about volume of hypertrophy, how to periodize your training. Now, Dr. Eric Helms is not only a doctor, he is also a coach, an athlete, and an author. We had a great conversation. But before we go ahead and go into that, I have to shout out the sponsors, Revive MD. Check out revivesubs.com. You can check out my very own athlete stack if you go on there, and you can get 20% off if you use my discount code DaruStrong20 at your final checkout. Also, if you are a coach looking to learn some of my methods, my programs, my protocols for all the athletes that I work with and that I use and that I've developed over 10 plus years of coaching, check it out. It'll be in the link in the description. You'll get access for life for a one-time fee. So go ahead and check it out. Now, let's get on to the podcast.
Welcome to the Daru Strong Podcast. Daru Strong Podcast.
Let's go. Mind over matter. Put your mind somewhere else and keep going. That little voice in your head is trying to stop you from getting to where you want to be. Be successful and keep moving forward.
With your host and world-renowned strength and conditioning coach, Phil Daru.
Yeah, so I was in the Air Force as a young man, and I was enlisted. And around 2004, I got bit by the iron bug, and for me, it was very much a coping method. I was having stuff going on in my life at the time, and what started as a kind of masochistic obsession and probably an unhealthy relationship with the iron turned into something that became really good for me. And, I built a lot of self-efficacy. It gave me an outlet. It gave me something to pursue. And it became my career. I became a trainer in 2005, like most of us, too early after lifting weights because I thought I knew everything. Did my first powerlifting competition in 2006, my first natural bodybuilding season in 2007. And I found I really liked the more, not all the way extreme side of the sport, obviously, because I'm competing in natural bodybuilding, but the more extreme side of it, having at least extreme goals, like 1RM strength, getting as lean as possible, maintaining as much muscle. And I found that the science behind that, manipulating the body, was equally as interesting as the practice. So, fast forward today, now it's, 16 years after I began lifting. So my lifting can now drive. It's got its permit. I'm a little worried about hanging out with the wrong crowd, maybe starting drinking too early. But I've got a late teen lifter inside of me. And I am a research fellow here at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. So lifting, pretty cool. Just picking up and putting down heavy objects has brought me all the way across the world. And I started a number of small businesses with my colleagues. So 3D Muscle Journey is where we coach and assist and provide mentorship and content for the drug-free lifting community. We work primarily with natural bodybuilders, but also a lot of drug-free powerlifters and other strength athletes. So that's something we do. And then I've also got books that I write. So basically science communication for the lifter, and also the Mass Research Review, where we review all of the most recent stuff that's coming out that's relevant to strength and physique athletes every month.
As far as research, what are you researching at the moment?
Yeah, so I did my PhD specifically looking at autoregulation, so using kind of intra-session changes to load for powerlifting and how to manipulate volume and some other things like that. I did my master's on manipulating protein intake and dieting strength athletes and bodybuilders. So some people see me as a sports nutrition guy. Some people see me as an exercise science guy. I see myself as a sports scientist, and my sports are strength and physique sport. So that means it encompasses a lot of the nutrition stuff, a lot of the training stuff. But if you were to be like, hey, tell me about nutrition or training for a marathon, I'd be like, I don't know, So I have a pretty narrow skill set. It just so happens to overlap with a lot of what people in the fitness community are interested in.
Yeah, you're an expert in the field of what you know, right? You don't go with what you don't know, and that's important for a lot of people to understand, because a lot of people think they know everything, and I think at an expert level, you want to have that tunnel vision focus on what you actually know. And for me, I feel like that's the same thing in the combat sports world. I don't want to try to step out of that realm in a sense. I always want to learn and grow, but I know what to talk about and what not to talk about. So today I am going to talk to you about some things when it comes down to physique training. Also, I want to talk about a little bit of what your thoughts on program design, mesocycles, things of that nature for hypertrophy and for strength, because again, that's your field of expertise. But if you can give us kind of give us a couple of main focus points that someone needs for physique building. And again, you have that. I want you to hit on that muscle and strength pyramid that you have there too as well, and kind of go over like what you would, categorize as the main focus points when it comes down to building a better physique.
For sure. Yeah, no, I like the way you position that. And I think I like that you brought up the muscle and strength pyramids, which are in my book, which are told through the lens of a hierarchy. And the reason why I explain it as a hierarchy is that most people get overwhelmed with information. Internet's great in that you don't have people who have to rely on magazines or just the biggest guy or gal or more successful athlete that they know. Instead now, you can find everything at your fingertips. But unfortunately, that means that biggest guy or gal who's at your gym has an Instagram now. So they can also promote their own information. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's great because, then it can get challenged. But it's very difficult as someone who is not well-read or experienced to kind of parse fact from fiction. Yeah. So through my consults over the years when I was a full-time coach with people who were trying to get as big as possible or get as strong as possible, often people had all the information, but they had no idea what was important, what was sort of important, what was critical, and what was something they needed to be focusing on. Okay. So people would they would know what type of protein powder they wanted to take post-workout and before bed, but they wouldn't know how many grams of protein they're eating in the day, things like that. Mm-hmm. So I think for programming for hypertrophy, it's really important if you understand on a basic, kind of high level, but fundamental understanding of what causes muscle growth. And that is progressive tension overload at the fiber level. So what that means, when people hear progressive tension overload, they kind of think like, I got to lift heavy. But if you were to do a set of 20 to failure, to where you could not do another rep unless you had a spot, individual fibers are actually going to be exposed to a very high load, a very high level of tension as other fibers fatigue out. And that's why you see guys who are pro bodybuilders who train exclusively high rep, or you see guys like Ronnie Coleman who trained really low rep, or Dorian Yates, and both can get you there. So there's two components there. That means that we need to be training progressively. It doesn't matter what your 1RM is. It just matters that you're stronger than you were before, or you're probably going to be the same size. Yep. And secondly, we need to make sure that effort is there. So whether you're doing, training like heavy style, like 4 to 8 RM most of the time, and reasonably close to failure, or if you're going to be training light, that's fine, but you have to take it to the house. You've got to, if you're doing 15 to 20 reps, you need to be able to only do maybe 16, 17, 18, 20, 25 reps tops. So proximity to failure and then progression are those two big components. Okay. After that, another really important aspect of it is sufficient volume. So for example, you get maximum tension on a muscle from doing a 1RM on an exercise that targets it, right? Like you could make the argument that the most stimulative, rep you could ever do on your quads would be like a 1RM ass to grass, like high bar squat. Yeah. But how much of a dose of that is there? It's a very small dose. So if you think of volume, quote unquote, it's kind of like the dosage of tension. Mm-hmm. So when you look at studies where you compare sets of 3 to sets of 10, even though the set of 3, all those 3 of those reps were much more stimulative than those 10, a set of 10 is still 10 reps. So even if they're, say, 10, 20% more stimulative, they're less than a third the total number of reps. Mm-hmm. So you have to basically do a little more volume to compensate for very low rep training. That's why when you see like high level powerlifters, they might do like 6x3, 5x5, not 3x10. So overall, we need to see sufficient volume, progressive overload, and then effort. So you're actually getting reasonably close to failure. And then you need to have a good balance of exercises. You don't want to be too much of a specialist like an Olympic weightlifter or a power lifter. Mm-hmm. I generally give people like, hey, here's your baseline, and it's a category of 6 exercises: a horizontal push and pull, a vertical push and pull, a hip hinge, kind of like a deadlift or a good morning or a back extension. It could be a lot of things depending on your sport. And then some kind of squat pattern, which just means relative good range of motion at the knee. And that could be a squat, that could be a lunge, that could be a leg press. So if you do all of those things and then you apply those principles I just talked about to it, then you can make a pretty good program. As far as kind of understanding the hierarchy, I think the reason why in my books I started with adherence is that people love to find like a cookie cutter program, and they find this optimal program that's 5 days a week. But let's say you're a fighter, you're fighting 4 or 5 days a week, maybe more. Correct me if I'm wrong, Phil, right? And then you're expected to do conditioning that is not, hypertrophy. You've got to build your aerobic and anaerobic engines. You got to do energy specific training for what you have to do. And then you're also supposed to build size. Are you really going to lift weights 5 days a week? You probably crush yourself. If not, get divorced or not ever see your kids or what have you. Yeah. So it's a different value proposition for someone who only can train twice a week versus a bodybuilder who everything's dedicated to building their physique. Mm-hmm. So that's why I often don't recommend looking to the people who dedicate. I mean, they understand the principles, but they won't know how to help you that well. Like just a bodybuilder off the street who is huge. Yeah. If he tries to give a bodybuilding program to a fighter or even the general population person, it won't be good. And that's why athletes are only good trainers once they've been trainers for a while.
Yeah, that's a good point. A really good point. That's why I was like, all right, let me just see exactly when I started coaching. It was funny because I was fighting and coaching at the same time. So for me, I would take some of the stuff that I was doing on myself to see if it worked, and then I would go ahead and implement that in with the people that I was training. And luckily, they were my teammates, and they weren't paying me as much. Now I have some guys that truly put their all into me, and at least I've been there. I can see, okay, this is working well, and it's been working for a long time. So, but that's really good that you put that, because I think adherence is a major key in all sports, not just for physique training, but in anything really if you're trying to be successful. When you talked about sufficient volume, how can one, I guess, measure up their volume intake that's going to, one, get them to where they need from a progressive standpoint, but also not drive them into overtraining?
Great question. So the question we often ask in research for high performance is what gets me the maximal response? And the assumption, the bias you go into it when you read bodybuilding centric or high performance centric research is that we're okay with what we would consider a shitty deal in finances, right? So if I tell you, you have to do 10 times the volume for 20% more progress, you're like, sign me up. I'm a meathead. I'm good with that. However, that's a very different calculus if you're talking to someone who only has 2 days per week, whether they're a mother of 4 who works a full-time job or whether they're a full-time fighter. I think that same calculus applies. So as an example, there was a fantastic meta-analysis done a few years back by Schoenfeld and colleagues. Schoenfeld's one of the most prolific researchers in the area of hypertrophy, used to compete in bodybuilding. So that's the lens, similar lens that I would have. What's going to get me the most growth, period, whatever I got to do, right? And they looked at the dose response of numbers of sets per muscle group per week. And that is probably the easiest way to calculate volume. It's very easy to do for a coach, easy to do for an athlete. And it makes sense based on what we talked about before. If a set of 6 and a set of 20 on a set-by-set basis stimulate the same growth, and that's probably a decent heuristic, you have to do enough reps. And if you do a lot of reps, you got to take it close to failure, because it's kind of that same thing again. Eventually you'll get to that point where you've stimulated the fiber. Then we can count, at least from a hypertrophy perspective, from a stimulus perspective, maybe not the total workload or energy expenditure or fatigue, but from a stimulus perspective, we can count sets per muscle group per week, or maybe I should say hard sets if we take into account that effort. Okay. All right. So in this meta-analysis, they found that doing 1 to 4 sets produced about 62, I think, % of the muscle growth that was seen in this meta-analysis. This is looking at a bunch of studies on hypertrophy. Going from 5 to 9 got you up to around like 85%. I may be a little off on the numbers, but I think the general idea is there. And to get to the maximal amount, like the highest hypertrophy rates, that occurred in the studies where they did 10 plus sets. Okay. So if I was to talk, like this is a bodybuilding podcast, I'd be like, a decent place to start, since most studies are on novices and it is to failure. We can guess that that's kind of capping the amount of sets that people can do, is let's do 10 sets per muscle group, or roughly around there based on your prior data, if you're like a novice bodybuilder to start. And that's really not that much when you think about it. Spread that out over a couple sessions per muscle group per week, and we've got a program. And that might be like an upper lower 4-day split. That's like your stock standard novice bodybuilder program.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
However, again, if we're dealing with someone who is looking to use hypertrophy to support their sport performance, they want that to be an underlying quality of maximal force production, right? If I tell them, hey, you can do 4 sets per week and you can get about 2/3 of the gains you get if you did 15, sign me up, right?
Yeah.
You're thinking of what is the largest payoff?
Yeah.
When am I going to get the highest ROI, that return on investment?
Sure.
And that's something that becomes the question anytime you're dealing with an athlete who has multiple components that contribute to his or her performance.
Yeah.
What's the least amount of time I can invest to say maintain my aerobic engine while now I'm focused on something sports specific?
Yeah.
So this ties into periodization. Like we're building these qualities, like, for fighters who, and correct me if I'm wrong again, you're not competing every weekend or anything like that. It's a very, different kind of calculus. You're trying to get the most adaptations all at the same time. They're going to make you effective in that fight. You don't want to lose the aerobic base. You don't want to lose the anaerobic base. You don't want to lose the size. You don't want to lose the strength, but you need to get really good at, punching somebody in the face when it comes to game day. So you're figuring out what is the minimum dose that I can use to maintain all those prior qualities. And that program looks very different than when you were 24 weeks out from a program. So I think that's the lens to look through it. And that's why adherence is so important. If you're being asked, and this is especially important when you have a team working with someone, when you're not the only coach, if you have an S&C who's communicating with a skills coach, who's communicating with maybe the nutritionist or a physio, everyone's got to be on the same page. That's a challenge. Anyone who's worked in the S&C world understands that. So you're looking at, all right, this athlete's being asked to do rehab stuff. This athlete is being asked to manipulate their nutrition. They're being asked to do cardio on their own. They have to do stretching. They're going to lift weights, and they're also going to come and fight all at the same time. So what's going to be the least amount I can give them that's going to have a measurable change in the direction we want to go is more often the question than how do I get the most out of this adaptation, regardless of having to do a poor ROI at volume.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's one thing where we talked about the minimal effective volume versus the maximal recoverable volume. In a sense, when you have multiple modalities of training that you have to adhere to throughout the week, that's what I live on. You know what I'm saying? When it comes to combat sports training, when it comes to any, I would say, field-based sport, any combat sport, because there's so many other factors, as opposed to a strength sport where the goal is to get as strong as possible, with those 3 lifts or, 2 lifts, whatever it be, weightlifting or powerlifting. And then from a hypertrophy standpoint, if you're a bodybuilder, well, then you could, I think, go a little bit harder. Am I wrong there? Because at the end of the day, the goal is to build as much muscle as possible. So you're hitting on those factors, right? We are getting that progressive tension. Your efforts are always going to be RPE 9 and 10 because you want to build up and get that, that metabolic stress build up and everything there. And then that volume is higher. But that's where I wanted to talk to you about that, because this is your world. You talked about periodization. From a periodization standpoint, what's a basic mesocycle look like? And you can obviously put in that MRV, even the MEV, and even the adaptable volume that I've heard you guys talk about a lot. Where does that fit into a structured program?
Yeah, great question. So for the listener, those terms that you're throwing around, introduced by Mike Israetel, who's a thought leader in this space. They're not directly in sports science literature. If you were to read science, you wouldn't see them. But I do think they're useful concepts to kind of help us understand what I was talking about before. So MEV is the minimum effective volume. MAV is the maximum adaptive volume, and MRV would be maximum recoverable volume. And I think for anyone who's not a bodybuilder, the concept of what's the most volume I can do of physique training by barely recovering on a week-to-week basis, you shouldn't even be anywhere near that. And I don't think most bodybuilders should be there, maybe most of the time anyway. We do care about what's the maximum adaptive volume. And if we were to go back to that Schoenfeld meta-analysis, in that population with those studies, when training to failure under those paradigms, we're probably around 10 plus.
Yeah.
Minimum effective, again, is like 1 set per muscle group. That's hard, right? Now, those values probably change the more adaptations you make. There's a great speculative review that was written not too long ago about how a walking program for someone who is highly sedentary and high in body mass could be considered a hypertrophy program because it's progressive to sitting on the couch and not doing anything, right?
Yep.
And that's a common thing we see is that aerobic interventions actually produce small amounts of increases in lean body mass in people who are sedentary. Because, look at it this way. We really want to take this extreme. The fastest way to lose a crap ton of muscle is become an astronaut. Leaves the Earth's gravity well. And when you come back, you're going to struggle to move and you're going to put on your normal amount of muscle mass. We all have a certain amount of like Earth training of 1G, right? Of just moving our body in space. So we all have some amount of like minimum training stimulus at all times. So we have to go above that. So if you're someone who trains 10 hours a week with weights, that gets upshifted and then everything else follows as well. So I think from a programming perspective for a mesocycle for someone who's interested in hypertrophy, you probably want to start somewhere between the minimum effective volume and the maximum adaptive volume. Because you don't know what that is. Your MRV might be lower than it. Like if you take a novice lifter, someone who's never trained with weights before, they get an extreme amount of muscle damage and soreness from the first session they do. You do 1 set of 10 on squats that's reasonably close to failure. You or I would be fine the next day. It's only 1 set. If you do that with a novice, they'll be noticeably sore and their force production will be down for 48 to 72 hours. So that changes a little bit. So when you're new, it is all about starting with that MEV, because even doing MEV for someone who is new to weights, they're going to get a very large return on investment. Okay. So in general, what I'd recommend for someone is to start somewhere in that range of what we think might be reasonable or close to optimal. And I think we start with that lens of adherence. So what can I invest? If that's only 2 days per week, that probably means you're going to do upper one day, lower another day, or full body on both days. And I'd probably start with somewhere, okay, what time can you invest? And let's figure out what amount of volume can we get. So I almost always start practical. If when I'm not working with a bodybuilder, when I work with a bodybuilder, I still do. It's just a much broader range because we're not juggling other aspects. So let's say we had a fighter and they were training twice per week. I would probably give them a full body. And I don't really care if they're like long head or their tricep hypertrophy. So what I care about is like overall lean body mass accrual, because a hypertrophy program and a bodybuilding program are a little different. A good example, if you have narrow clavicles in bodybuilding, I'm always going to want to build your delts bigger. Even if I was to like cut you up like Frankenstein style and put your delt next to someone else's, if it was bigger, it doesn't look as big when you're on stage because you're not as wide, because we're trying to create that X frame. You're standing next to someone else.
Gotcha.
But if you're a fighter, I just want you to have a lot of deltoid mass. I want you to be able to produce a lot of force when you're flexing your shoulder, right?
Yeah.
So the calculus I make, is if we're inducing hypertrophy is to look a certain way for physique. If we're inducing hypertrophy for performance, it is to actually contribute to your eventual maximum force production by giving us more contractile tissue. So it's going to be a more balanced program, typically, generally, or biased toward your sport performance, the specific hypertrophy you might need. Assuming you need hypertrophy everywhere, let's say maybe your alignment, for example, or you're a power lifter where you pretty much need all the muscle across those 3 lifts, then we were probably going to have a split between those 6 kind of movement patterns. 3 of those are going to get taken up quite easily by your sport. You're squatting, benching, and deadlifting. So we got a hip hinge, a horizontal push, and we've got a squat, right? So I would be throwing in on top of that and working in a kind of a volume block. I'd be doing, shoulder presses, lat pull downs, and then a little bit of isolation work here and there, and rows. And if I'm taking just a general person, same lens, I just don't have those big 3 to work with. So we're going to figure out, what do you have access to? What range do you prefer training in? Or do we care about strength or not? Or are we just trying to put on size? And we would just see a kind of a steady progression over those 4 weeks. Kind of as a general rule, it's not about lifting the most you can on any given day in hypertrophy training for pure bodybuilding. While strength, we're trying to encourage, the most rapid progression in strength we can. Deload, do it again, kind of thing. For hypertrophy, it's more like we want to make sure we are progressing, because it's almost the opposite lens. It's not that getting stronger causes hypertrophy. It's that when you have bigger muscles, you should be stronger. So we're almost looking at your performance as a metric of whether what we're doing is working. So if I can see that you're doing more reps across 4 sets of cable rows or a slightly higher load for the same reps, that tells me you're probably growing once we've gotten that initial movement competency down.
Gotcha.
So progress is not, we're not doing everything we can to get as many reps as possible, hammering failure and thinking about this as a strength program in the 8 to 12 rep range. Rather, we're thinking of it as I want the effort to be there. I want the volume to be there. I want the intent to be there, good technique. And if we're doing everything right and it is sufficient volume and you are close enough to failure and you're getting enough out of your sets, then we should see your strength going up either in reps or load.
Gotcha.
So an example of a mesocycle, I might set you up with 10 sets per muscle group spread across a couple different days, maybe 3 days at most if someone's an athlete. Upper lower full body, do more compounds on that full body day, and we'll do more isolation and machine work on the upper lower days. Work across the spectrum of the 6 to 20 rep range just to hypothetically get every avenue to muscle growth. And then each week we're looking to maintain a certain RPE range or proximity to failure. Like, hey, I want to see you on your big compound lifts. I want to see you at least at a 6 RPE, let's say 4 reps from failure. And with cumulative fatigue from multiple sets, getting closer to being 0 to 2 reps from failure. On your isolation work, your machine work, the less fatiguing stuff, we can be at like an 8 to 10 RPE, 0 to 2 reps from failure. Start around 2, let cumulative fatigue drive us to close to failure. And then each week we try to make like a micro loading increase. Like, hey, let's try to add the load a little bit. And if you just kind of hang around a certain RPE range, that'll happen naturally if you're doing enough volume.
Yeah.
Your ability to increase the load tells you whether it's progressive, whether it's an adaptive stimulus. If last week you could do 4x8 with 100 pounds on rows, and this week you can do 4x8 with 105, and it's the same effort. It feels like it took as much effort. That's great. That means you're making progress.
Yeah.
And that's a really basic approach. And most athletes, they're not elite level bodybuilders that need to think about, complex like block periodized models or anything like that. They should just focus on like steady progression over time.
So just a basic linear progression over time is what we're really trying to see.
Absolutely. And, there's going to be time points when you need to deload. You're probably going to be bootstrapping your other athletic qualities, their periodization to your hypertrophy program. Like if you have a peak of, time spent doing anaerobic training, your session RPEs are higher, you're doing more specific work. You don't want that to occur at the same time as doing a crap ton of hypertrophy work. You're going to go into each one of those sessions sore, which we know actually impairs motor patterns and motor learning. It impedes recovery. It can result in central fatigue. So we would probably be like, hey, when you're further away, like when you're outside of hypertrophy, training stress is lower, we'll do a little more. So you can almost have this kind of convergent periodization where you're starting with a little more hypertrophy work and tapering it off just to maintain it while you do more sport specific stuff, which is basic periodization.
What I'm gathering now is that we still want that linear progression of hypertrophy training, right? Now, for me, I'll do either a 3-week pendulum wave for my strength work, where I'll do a 3 up, 1 down, and then repeat. I can still go linear with the accessory work, added that I want to bring up, let's say, upper back, glutes, hamstrings, keep that linear, but also work on those other aspects of periodization, whatever model I decide, whether it be conjugate even, or even just a standard block. But I can still progress that going further when it comes down to building up weak points in the body. Because if you're looking at it from my perspective, at least, with the fighters that I have, they're anterior dominant, right? So I want to build up the posterior chain, balance out the body. I can work that in progression and then also make sure that I'm obviously calculating what they're doing from a weight perspective and keeping the RPEs the same, right? Right around, you said 6 to 8 to maintain there. And then maybe on the last week or even on a deload week, I could probably increase that to a 9 or 10 RPE because now we're bringing down the intensity of the main lifts. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. So something very similar to what you described. A lot of the times when I have someone, because most people, they don't just want to get big or strong. They like both, and it's not like getting stronger hurts your hypertrophy. Yeah. So let's take, for example, a off-season non-competitive powerlifter, because that I think that almost describes a lot of people who are just interested in lifting weights. They want to get stronger. They want to get bigger. Uh-huh. So I might take, like you said, a wave loading for the main lifts. So let's take a upper body day, quote unquote. Over 3 weeks, they might go 3x8, 3x7, 3x6 on bench. But then all of their accessories, like a lat pull down, a row, arm work, lateral raises, let's say that's what they do after they bench, right?
Yep.
That might be fixed at 3x8 to 15, quote unquote, double progression. What's double progression? Well, we might start with 3x10. It's something you can complete, a load you can complete for 3x10. So you're probably starting a few reps short of failure in that first one and hitting failure in the last one. And then you microload each week until eventually that becomes 3x15 and you could finish it. And once you can get 15, 15, 15 with what started at the beginning of the mesocycle, or maybe 2 mesocycles ago, you're 3x10, then you've earned the right to go up and load. Okay. And now you go from, let's say, 3x10 on 30-pound dumbbell curls to 3x15 on 30-pound dumbbell curls. Now you can go start with the 35s and you start back at like 8 reps. Because again, that's actually a big jump in load, going from 30s to 35s on bicep curls. But then you work on making it until I can get 3 sets of 15 with 35 pounds, then I go up. So it's almost like the accessories are like independent of the strength periodization. They're just kind of going on in the background. You're slowly increasing reps. You might deload them, like you said. But those main lifts are following some more logical progression where you're trying to get them peaked at certain points that might align with the rest of your training. Okay, gotcha. So we're always making sure that we're staying in that RPE until they have that ability to increase the reps, and then we can increase the weight from there after they have increased the reps in that range of hypertrophy, you would say? Yeah, so the RPE is an interesting thing. So like if I was talking to a bunch of bodybuilders, I would probably have the RPE stay a little lower, because now we're looking, all right, your whole schedule is bodybuilding training. And I won't spend too much time on this because I know that's not your audience, but I think you would probably the thing is, when you go to failure, you induce more muscle damage. You induce a little more stimulus, but the payoff is a little unbalanced if we look at some of the data. We've seen, the difference between stopping short of failure and going to failure might be an additional day of having force suppression and being unable to train effectively, right? Yeah. So I would rather have a bodybuilder who is maybe training, let's say 5 days a week. Let's say they're on upper, lower, full body. That means I got to keep them relatively fresh. They can accumulate a lot of volume at a reasonably high effort. So if I was to take any one of those days in a vacuum, like if I just took that random second upper body day, right, and they're training mostly at like a 7 to 9 RPE, so that's 1 to 3 reps short of failure, a hardcore bodybuilder would look at that and be like, but I could have done 1 to 3 more reps and I could have got a better stimulus. I'm like, yeah, and then your full body day on Saturday is going to suffer. Like, what are you doing? So you kind of have to play chess instead of checkers as a bodybuilder. When you have 10 hours a week to dedicate to training, you pull back a little bit on the intensity so you can push the volume, and then you push the frequency up to distribute it better. And it's kind of that peak of the bell curve where you've got the best combination of volume, intensity, and frequency, which looks like something like a moderate to high frequency, a moderate to low volume per session, and then a moderate to moderately high RPE per session. So when you've combined all of those things, it looks a little different for bodybuilding. But when you're dealing with an athlete who may have a different schedule, so for example, they can only train twice a week. Now all of a sudden you can't do that. It's just not on the table. So your frequency needs to be necessarily 2 times per week, or say 3 times per week, which means that to get the best stimulus under those constraints, you actually want to push closer to failure. So RPEs do need to be higher if you have a lower total volume and a lower total frequency. I didn't miss a step, by the way. So just to recap, like, sure, a bodybuilder, we want to find that sweet spot, the top of the bell curve, maximize volume, maximize frequency, and then use the intensity that fits that. It's not too high, but it's still sufficient. However, a fighter who comes to you, they can only train twice per week. Yeah, you better be pushing those RPEs high, because you're only going to train on Tuesday and Saturday. You got much more time to recover. You can only do so much volume in a session before it becomes counterproductive. So you need to milk that volume for all it's worth. So I think RPEs must necessarily be higher to get an optimal stimulus when you're dealing with a fighter or someone who is any other, like a team sport athlete doing other stuff. And the only time that's not the case is when you have to do something like the day after that's sport specific. So when you get closer and closer to competition, that is when, the frequency stays low, and you might bring down the RPE, because you're just trying to maintain what you have. And you're hoping that the sport specific work will contribute to that. Like an Olympic lifter, it's not like you need squats to keep your quads. When you're close to competition, you're clean and jerking and snatching all the time. And if you're good, your clean and jerk is probably 90-80% of your front squat, and you do a lot of volume on that, you're squatting. Every movement's a squat.
For sure. Man, I could pick your brain on this all day long, but I'm not going to take up all your time on this one. I do want to get into supplements because I know it's a big thing in the industry, in the fitness industry and in the strength world. So what would you say, what's your opinion, I guess, on the best supplements that you would use for, let's say, recoverability, right? I know that's a big thing right now, especially for my fighters. I mean, the more we can recover from multiple bouts of training per week and per day, the better we're going to be. So what would you say would be your go-to supplements for increasing recovery?
That's a great question. And I think we need to consider what is recovery. And then if we consider what is recovery, we have to ask, what is fatigue? So the fatigue that you experience just from lifting generally falls into three categories. There is central fatigue, the actual ability to voluntarily activate muscle and recruit fibers. There is muscle damage, the actual structural damage to fibers, and which will also make those specific fibers unable to contribute much force. And then there's also metabolic fatigue, which is mostly just within session. If you're doing very high reps to failure, that burn you feel, that's the pH in the muscle dropping. That's from free radicals, hydrogen ions, lactate, and your ability to buffering and clear that out means that you'll recover set to set. And they're not really separate. Like if you were to dump a whole bunch of metabolic fatigue on somebody, that would cause central fatigue. That's the whole kind of central governor theory. Your body's going, you're doing too much, I'm pulling you back. Likewise, a bunch of muscle damage can result in a lasting central fatigue that can be a couple of days that reduces force production, which makes it very difficult to effectively train. Now, if we take a fighter and they're doing that weight training, they can have those three types of fatigue, but they're also going to get just fuel depletion, right? So they're going to be doing glycogen depleting training. So that means they also have to consider just glycogen stores, because if your glycogen stores drop to a certain point, guess what that causes? Well, that can cause central fatigue, and it also can acutely impact the contractility of muscles. So there's basically kind of four domains that you need to think about. There's the acute metabolic fatigue, and there are some supplements that can impact that. There is the replenishment of glycogen that you need to think about. There is mitigating muscle damage. And then there's also, central fatigue, which is almost like a byproduct of all that other stuff. So there's nothing you can specifically do there. There are some things you can get to be a little, parasympathetic or sympathetic dominant, like get a massage, get better sleep, things like that. They don't really fall into the umbrella of the supplements though.
Okay.
So everyone's probably familiar with creatine monohydrate. This is one of the energy systems, the phosphocreatine pathway. I wouldn't categorize it as a recovery supplement, because if we couldn't replenish ATP effectively, if like the phosphocreatine pathway didn't work, we'd have a lot more serious problems on our hands. Yeah. But other things like, carbohydrate supplements, or proper timing of carbohydrates. Like if you are training 2 times in a day or back-to-back days with a high volume, and it is something that's largely glycolytic, like demanding a lot of carbohydrates, like a lasting high intensity effort, you would probably benefit from having carbohydrates within, 30 minutes or an hour of finishing that first session. So you have it for the next one. So you could classify, carbohydrate powders into this for someone who is a fighter. For the acute metabolic fatigue, for being able to repeat performances, there's beta-alanine. So you probably heard of beta-alanine. You've probably taken it. It's probably giving you the tingles, which you're not a fan of. But hey, if you're getting punched in the nose, I'm sure you can take it. So beta-alanine is what allows your body to create muscle carnosine. And muscle carnosine, I talked about, free radicals, hydrogen ions, and lactate, and dropping pH. That's a physiological buffer. So higher levels of muscle carnosine allow you to better buffer performance, and you might be able to squeeze out a few more reps or recover a little better if you only had like a restricted rest interval. So beta-alanine is something I would definitely consider as a fighter. That absolutely falls into the categories of the kind of that acute recovery. So that's something that builds up in your system, kind of like creatine. It's in a lot of pre-workouts. It's not a proper pre-workout because it's not acute effects. You actually want to take it for a while, get your muscle carnosine stores up, very similar to muscle creatine stores, and that'll help performance. As far as mitigating muscle damage, a big part of that is getting sufficient protein intake in. Mm-hmm. So I think absolutely you can make an argument for, a protein supplement. these will probably have less of a benefit the higher your overall protein intake is. So if you're already walking around consuming like, 0.7, 0.8 up to 1 gram per pound of body weight in protein, throwing a whey protein shake on top of that probably won't help. But if you're someone who is, fluttering around that like 0.7, 0.8 range, maybe you are, vegan or vegetarian, or maybe you're cutting weight and you're just not eating a lot of food, then it would definitely make sense to probably supplement with protein to try to get up to, say, like a gram per pound is a decent guideline. And powders can absolutely help with that. So yeah, I think those in general would be what I'd recommend. A lot of the other supplements that are out there, they could potentially help with sleep, which would indirectly help with recovery. Low dose melatonin, just not eating right before bed. That's something that a lot of people do. That's very common in the bodybuilding community. Have a meal before bed. It's typically just protein, which is probably not a big deal. Yeah. But restricting your feeding window to maybe like 10 or 12 hours and having a couple hours free before you go to bed, that has been shown in the research to improve sleep quality. Wearing like earplugs, sleeping in a dark, like decent temperature room where you're not too hot, not too cold, having undisturbed sleep and getting a solid 8 hours, not waking up to an alarm. I think all those things can make a huge difference on improving recovery.
Yeah, I have to reiterate that because sleep and nutrition obviously are going to be the main focus points when you're talking about fatigue management, and then also having a solid program and periodizing appropriately. But yeah, the supplements, I know I get a ton of questions on them, and again, it's like at the end of the day, let's make sure that these things are taken care of before you use those supplements, as that's what it's called. It's a supplement. But that's great that you said that. So I have 2 questions that I usually ask all of my guests.
I have one more supplement I forgot to mention.
Okay, go ahead.
And it's not going to make a huge night and day difference, but it's a part of a healthy diet. They're essential fatty acids, and there is some research showing that like moderate to higher dosages, I'd say like 2 to 3 grams of EPA and DHA combined, might reduce muscle damage a little bit. It won't be night and day, and if it doesn't have much of a difference for you, that's okay. It'll probably improve some other health marker. So that's not a bad recommendation. By the way, when you're trying to figure out how much EPA and DHA, specific types of fatty acids, you want to look on the back of that fish oil label. It'll tell you how many grams of fish oil there are, and then underneath that, it'll have EPA and DHA. And you want to try to get that to that 1 to 3 gram range per day. So it might be like 6 fish oil tablets or something like that, depending on the density of that type of fatty acid.
Yeah, I'll usually take about 3 to 6 per day. And that was more so for like joint health and a little bit of tendonitis issues. But again, when it comes down to recoverability, I think it's helped me out a lot. So, I was going to say that. And then what about vitamin D3? What do you think about that?
Yeah, D3, I think it's like any mineral or vitamin that you're deficient in can impact recovery, but I wouldn't necessarily in my brain categorize them as recovery supplements. I'd categorize them as, correcting a deficiency. Nope. So yeah, absolutely. Before I recommend vitamin D to anybody, I really recommend they actually get blood work done. You want to check your 25 OHD levels, and you want to be, depending on the metric, you want to be above insufficient. You don't want to be just deficient. So I don't want to give numbers because there's a couple of different ways it can be measured. Yeah. And if I tell you the different measurement characteristic and you forget, then you'll think you're deficient when you're not, or take too much. But definitely get blood work done. Look at that value. That value is less accurate people who are dark skinned, by the way. So that seems to hold reliably as a marker of signs of deficiency in people with light skin. The people who are dark skinned, there is, hopefully we'll have a way of measuring it soon, actually like bioavailable 25 OHD. But I don't know enough about that to be confident recommending, but absolutely don't be vitamin D deficient is a good recommendation.
Nice. Perfect. All right. So I'm going to give you these questions. I'm sure you can answer them pretty well. The first one's pretty easy though. So what is Dr. Eric Helms' daily routine? Because I know if you're a successful person, people that want to be successful are going to follow some of your routine. So hopefully you got something good, but go ahead.
I finished playing Call of Duty around 2 a.m. And that's right around the time I've also finished my Ben & Jerry's. Now, in all seriousness, I tend to wake up first thing, and pretty much counter to what most people think is a good idea. I actually finish. I do my social media post and I finish it for the day, like by 8:30 a.m. And I'll explain why I do that and not like get into deep work first, like most people recommend. From there, every morning I take a walk with my wife and we go get breakfast at one of the cafes we like. So that's time to connect with my wife, clear my head, start for the day, have a nice breakfast and get my step count up, get some sunlight, speaking of vitamin D. The reason why I do my Instagram post first is so that it's done and it's gone and I'm not spending all my time on social media.
Sure.
I also find that accumulating easy wins gives me a little more momentum, if you will, a little more self-belief. It lowers my anxiety levels of like shit I got to do. Like the monkey on my back gets a little smaller. It goes from like gorilla to like spider monkey. If I get some quick wins. So the first things I do in the day is I knock out that social media post. I don't do it every day, but most days of the week I post on Instagram something that I value, something that's relevant. Often if I do a podcast, thank you, Phil, I have something to share. So a lot of it is just, hey, check out this content I made. Then I go to breakfast, I get back, and I normally reserve this time slot that we're doing right now for interviews, podcasts, or meetings.
Nice.
So I'm an extrovert. I wouldn't recommend this to an introvert. Don't go out there and drain your social energy first thing in the morning and then try to do the rest of your day. But it works great for me. Like I connect with someone, I talk about something I enjoy, lifting weights. And then I've gotten some easy wins on Instagram. I've had breakfast with my wife. I've gone on a walk. I've seen the sun, and I've talked to someone about something I love. And now I'm actually ready to work. And I normally spend around, depending on where the podcast ends, like 11 a.m. my time or 11:30 a.m. my time, up to 3 or 4 more hours to get a solid chunk of work done. And at that point, I typically train or eat lunch, depending on just whether I'm training or not that day. And then I decide after training whether or not I'm going to keep working or not. This might be dictated by deadlines, but if I've done my job right and I put in a good solid 3 to 4 hours of work before that, I often have the choice just to recreate, do something, read, whatever. And that's kind of how I set myself up for wins for the rest of the day.
That's perfect, man. I think that everybody should have that first part of that day ironed out to just hammer on what you want to get done first and foremost so that you can do other things throughout the day. I try to segment my days to where like after 12 o'clock, primarily, a lot of times I'm coaching, but the things that I need to get done for myself, I get done almost before like 6 o'clock in the morning. So I wake up usually around 4:30 a.m. because I have to take my son to school. That's usually a time I can play with him a little bit, go over some homework and then take him to school and then, go from there. Obviously I picked him up early today because he's running around here, but I've been gone. So that I was gone for a little bit as we talked about, and now I'm back. So he's like, Dad, I gotta come with you. So yeah, but anyways, I appreciate it. So now the last one is going to be, and this can be anything. It doesn't have to be just like physical, right? It could be mental. What does a strong person mean to you, and kind of define what strength actually means in your own way?
I think someone who keeps moving forward. And, I absolutely don't think we should limit it to physical things, because I would classify someone like Stephen Hawking as an incredibly strong person, someone who is strong of will, strong in his contribution to society, strong in overcoming, challenges, that type of thing. I think that's inspiring to me. I think part and parcel of moving forward is you have to know what your values are. You have to know what your mission statement is. Anytime I talk to anyone who wants to be a trainer or start a business, any kind of entrepreneurial questions I get, before anything else, I think you need to start with what are my values, and then how do I build a mission statement on that? What gets me excited? What am I passionate about? And how do I feel like I can contribute to the community I'm a part of? It also makes you make less arrogant mistakes. You're not going to be the person on Twitter who everyone face palms when they read it, because it's not just about you. It's not about building yourself up. It's about making yourself bigger so you can push everyone forward. So I see someone who has a strong set of values, a strong mission statement, and is moving forward based on those, and is overcoming the challenges that are set before them because they're motivated by something that's bigger than just their own identity. I think that to me is someone who I see as strong, even if I don't necessarily have the same values as them. So I think that's something I can look to and respect.
Nice, man. Great response. I appreciate it. Well, Eric, you definitely are a strong person. I can see that. For just keep going forward every time we lose our connection here.
That connection.
But man, I do appreciate it. I know you're super busy, and I know that your time is valuable. So I do appreciate you coming on, man.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on. I really hope this was helpful, having some nerdy bodybuilder on your podcast of people who are actual athletes.
Hey, man, every time I get to speak to you, I'm going to try to keep talking to you because I'm learning a lot here, and I do appreciate it. And again, make sure you go ahead and check him out on Instagram. Go ahead and shout out your Instagram real quick.
Yeah, follow me at Helms 3DMJ. From there, you can find links to most of the stuff I've kind of hinted at here. Research review if you're super nerdy, my books if you're less nerdy, and then also just if you want to listen to me yak at people more often, I definitely share every time I do a podcast on the gram.
All right. Thanks again for watching, guys. See you again next time.